We are answering question 1 today. When will these things happen? And that means, when will the temple be destroyed? Okay. When will the temple be destroyed? So Jesus, remember, they asked the question and Jesus starts answering it right away. So now what we're looking for, if partial preterism, the timeline is correct, and the tribulation has already happened. If that's correct, then all the things that Jesus says when he's answering number 1 question, they will be things that already happened in the past. So as we are looking at these scriptures, we are looking to see if these indeed are things that happened in the past, okay? Partial or premillennialist, futurist say that all the things that Jesus says in response to this question, that those things have not happened yet. Okay, so this is how we're comparing and contrasting to see, what does the Bible say and how do we interpret it? Are these talking about things that have already happened or things that still are yet to happen? This one you will recognize. This is a big one. Okay, so next Jesus says this: therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, have you heard that before? The abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. So when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get things out of his house. And whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those women who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Moreover, pray that when you flee, it will not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Okay, so what is this abomination of desolation? Now, you hear about this from the futurists. So they say that this abomination of desolation is the Antichrist, and that at some point they believe the Jewish temple is going to be rebuilt in Jerusalem, because it's not standing now. It's now there is a Muslim temple in that location where the Jewish temple used to be. So they say that this Jewish temple is going to be rebuilt, and that the abomination of desolation is the Antichrist, and he's going to stand in the temple and desecrate it, and he's going to say that claim he is God. They get all this from what Jesus says right here. Jesus never mentions the Antichrist. He never says any of that, okay? So we get an idea of what Jesus means when he says abomination of desolation. We get an idea of what he's talking about in Luke, and let me tell you what I mean. Okay, so this whole story that we're going over in Matthew 24, where Jesus is asked these questions by the disciples and then he answers them, his answers, this event is also repeated in Mark and in Luke. So both Mark, Luke, and Matthew all tell about this event. They use very, very similar language, so similar that it's very clear that all three of them are talking about this exact same event. So usually they say the same language, except this one place, Luke says it a little bit differently. Now let me show you what Luke says. I have it in red. Okay, so here Luke says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her destruction is near. And then the rest of it is very similar to what Jesus said, or what Matthew says. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay, then he says some of the very same things. So instead of calling it the abomination of desolation, Luke says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Okay, so he uses that same word, desolation. So that's what abomination of desolation means. Okay, we got the same word, desolation. Okay. And the desolation, all these Roman soldiers, the armies standing around Jerusalem, the holy place, because Jerusalem was a holy city, that's the abomination. That's the abomination, okay? It's something horrible. The Israelites couldn't have thought of anything more horrible than the Romans coming and desecrating their temple. So that's the abomination of desolation. It's the Roman armies that are appearing and getting ready to destroy Jerusalem. Got one more scripture to back that up. Okay, so then Jesus says, he mentions Daniel. This abomination of desolation was spoken of through Daniel the prophet. Okay, so what does Daniel tell us? Okay, so they are talking about Daniel. Oops, get to the right page here. We're talking about Daniel 9:26, and Daniel says this: and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and that's exactly what happened. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. So that same word, desolation, Okay, so that's what Jesus was saying. He was like, okay, Daniel talked about this. This is when this prince who is to come, so probably talking about Nero, he will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, so all of this backs up what Luke said. He's talking about the armies. He is not talking about something that's going to happen in 2,000 years. He's talking about what happens in 87 when Jerusalem was destroyed. Okay. All right. A couple more points about this. Okay. So according to the futurists, they read all of this and they say, this is the Antichrist. This is a future. This is a warning to everybody in the world during the tribulation. All these terrible things are going to happen. So, but Jesus says very clearly, he's talking to people in Judea. So he says it right there, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So he's not talking to the whole world. He's talking to very specific people, these people in Judea, in Jerusalem. And then at the end, he says, it will pray that it won't be on the Sabbath. So he's talking to Jewish people because non-Jewish people don't recognize the Sabbath. So it's not going to matter to them if something bad happens on the Sabbath. Okay. So I think it's very clear that it makes much more sense that Jesus is talking about Jerusalem and what happened in AD 70. And here's one more thing. So Jesus had a very, very specific reason for telling his disciples this warning. So he says, and what we hear in Luke, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, okay, the desolation is near. This is the biggest sign. He says, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are inside the city must leave. Those who are in the country must not enter the city. Okay, and we saw in Matthew that he said, don't even go down into your house and don't go back and get your coat. Get out of the city. Okay, and so Josephus tells us that during this time, okay, so Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains. Okay, and so what happened was when the Roman soldiers came to Jerusalem, they first stood around the tops of the mountains around the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so all the people, when they did that, and they just stood there, they were trying to intimidate and let the Jewish people know that they were there. And so the Jewish people who were in the city, they could look up to the tops of the mountains and they could see all the Roman soldiers standing around the tops of the mountains. Okay, so it was a very intimidating, scary thing to see. Okay, and so that's what Jesus is warning them about. When you see this, when you see the armies, the Roman soldiers up on top of those mountains, get out of the city. And so what we find out from Josephus is that when this happened, there was a short time period, just a very short time period, when the Roman soldiers appeared at the tops of the mountains before they started coming down to the city, when people inside the city had time to escape and to flee and to get out. Because when the Roman soldiers got to the city, they sealed it all off. And so at that point, nobody else could leave the city. And Josephus talks about that. He said, so after that, all hope of escaping was now cut off from the Jews, together with their liberty of going out of the city. So Jesus very specifically told them this so that they would know what to do, so that they would be able to escape. Jesus wanted to make sure that his remnant Christians, his followers, would be saved, they would not all be killed like so many, the million Jews who were killed during this event. So they knew what to do. And there was a group of Christians who knew what to do because Jesus had given them this warning. They all knew what Jesus said. And so during this time period, when they saw those armies, they knew what he said and they ran out. And so there was a huge group of Christians who escaped in time because they had been given this warning, and they went to Pella and they were able to stay there and be safe during all of the horrible things that happened to Jerusalem after that. So, wow, to me, this was one of the biggest things as I read through this, to see how perfectly all of this stuff fits. Jesus's prophecies fits with what happened to Jerusalem in AD 70.